Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be today. My name is Hisham Salam, and on behalf of the Program on Arab Reform and Democracy at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, I would like to welcome you to our event today, Thinking About Democracy and Revolution, Egypt's 2011 Uprising, with the always brilliant, always prolific Mona El-Ghobashy. Before I introduce Mona, I would like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors. First, the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies at Stanford, especially my counterpart, Farah al-Sharif, and program coordinator Colin Hamill for all the work they've done to make this event happen. I would also like to extend our deepest appreciation to the 10 Years On project, in which ARD is a participant alongside a host of organizations at various universities and research centers. To learn more about the 10 Years On project, please visit www.thearabuprisings.org. I would like to thank our colleague at the Arab Studies Institute, Layla Nashashibi, for all her tireless efforts to promote this event and to live stream it on Jadaliya's Facebook page as we speak right now. I should also recognize the amazing work of my colleague and CDDRL communications manager, Nora Smith, in publicizing this event, so we can all convene here and learn about and learn from Mona El-Ghobashy's incredible research. For those who work on Egypt, Mona El-Ghobashy is in no need of an introduction, but she certainly deserves an introduction. She is a scholar of sociology and history of politics in Egypt and the broader Middle East and North Africa. She's currently a clinical assistant professor at liberal studies at New York University and has previously taught at Barnard College. In 2009, she was named a Carnegie Scholar by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. She has produced a wealth of publications on Egyptian politics and the dynamics of political contestation in the country before and after the 2011 uprising. Almost every article that Mona has written remains an important resource for scholars of Egyptian and Middle East politics. And at the risk of sounding super nerdy, almost all scholars of Egypt can list them or list these articles from memories. These include big hits such as the metamorphosis of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, the praxis of the Egyptian Revolution, and the liquidation of Egypt's illiberal experiment. I'm only listing some of my favorites, but there are a lot more. And today she is talking about her latest hit, her book, Bread and Freedom, Egypt's Revolutionary Situation, which was published in July by Stanford University Press. The book is about Egypt, but offers a wider invitation to scholars of politics at large to rethink dominant approaches to the study of revolutionary upheaval and their democratizing potential. Hence the title of the talk, Thinking About Democracy and Revolution. Without any further ado, Mona, it's all you.
Thank you so much, Hisham, for that lovely introduction. I hope that folks won't be disappointed after hearing such an introduction. I can hardly recognize myself. But I'm so pleased to be here. I'm so honored. And I would also like to thank all the folks who behind the scenes made this possible. I'm so excited today to share with you the results of some years of research hibernating to get at Egypt's revolutionary situation. The first thing I'd like to say is that I know that some of you who are listening and maybe all of you who are listening witnessed and lived through the years of 2011 to 2014 roughly, and remember certain moments. I just wanted to say that when we go back and revisit those moments, I think it's stunning. Probably the single most amazing thing to me was, though I was there in Egypt for a lot of the time and I breathed and lived these events, it's extraordinary how much I missed, partly because of the sheer speed and density of those events. So one of the things I'd like to do today is to take you back to those years and to advance an interpretation and start a discussion about how we might think about these extraordinary events that were almost too fast and too extraordinary, of such a magnitude that I think they always repay revisiting. So what I'd like to do today is to do a quick review of what those days were like, what some of the events I look at, and then advance my interpretation and leave it to the Q&A to pick up on certain themes that may be of more interest to the audience and getting into more detail. So just to take you back to 2011, I know that members of this audience don't need to necessarily be taken back, but let's just step back and see what happened in those times. Again, because all of these events on the region-wide scale were so extraordinary. Beginning in December 2010 and extending all the way to 2012, a wave of popular uprisings unseated 4 presidents for life. The picture on the left shows you these presidents at a summit a few months before they were toppled. And then a second wave in 2019, of course, netted 2 more of these longtime presidents. It's the political economist Roger Owen, the late political economist Roger Owen, who came up with this wonderful term, the presidents for life, and has written a book about it in 2012. In 2019, Omar al-Bashir, his 30-year rule of Sudan ended with a popular uprising in Cede outside the military headquarters. And it also in April, the longtime rule of the Algerian president Bouteflika also came to an end. And Sudan, Algeria are now in the throes of very turbulent transitions, just as the earlier risers of 2011 and 2012. When we think about these events, we tend to think about their consequences that we're living with today. And the consequences, of course, have been nothing short of catastrophic. Proxy civil war in Yemen, a divided Libya, a horrendous civil war in Syria, and a military coup in Egypt, and even Tunisia, which many people at first pegged as the success case because they had 2 successive handovers of power and a peaceful transition, as of July of this year, has witnessed what some political scientists call an auto coup, where the president, Sede, declared self-rule, shut down the parliament, suspended the constitution, and Tunisia is now in the throes of another political crisis. Not gainsaying all of these important developments, what I want to do is take us back to the beginnings, because I think if we look at the beginnings in a different way, as I'll argue, we may also gain a deeper understanding of the consequences, catastrophic as they may be. The central demand of the protesters, literally on the streets, the crowd-sourced slogans were Aish wa Hurriya, or in the case of Tunisia, the variation was Shughl wa Hurriya, bread and freedom. Many protesters took this very literally and used loaves of bread as props in their mass demonstrations. This recalls an earlier wave of uprisings. One of the quotes that I will come back to over and over again is by the famous Polish-born political scientist Adam Przeworski, who, speaking of an earlier wave of extraordinary upheavals starting in the late 70s and into the collapse of the former Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, he pointed out when he began his study, his now canonical study of these uprisings, to eat and to talk, to be free from hunger and repression. These elementary values animate a worldwide quest for political democracy and economic rationality. And the crowds, not having read Przeworski, of course, were revamping and reviving these 2 most basic demands of historic uprisings the world over. And indeed, in 2011, many of you know and will remember that 2011 in the Arab Spring, or the Arab uprisings, also catalyzed protests in Western Europe, specifically in Greece and Spain, later on in Russia, and they made it to the shores of the United States with the Occupy Wall Street movement. That was the beginning of the rise of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the Bernie Sanders phenomenon. So I just want to take us back to this global moment, because we are living in its repercussions. And that global moment was a worldwide uprising by peoples the world over, living under very different kinds of regimes, demanding that they not be ruled in the old manner. As the master slogan of the Arab uprisings put it, "Ash-shab yurid isqat an-nizam." The people will no longer be ruled in the old way and demand a wholesale system change, both in terms of the economic conditions under which they lived, but also in terms of the political restrictions placed on their daily lives, as diverse as those were in different countries. Let me do a quick thumbnail review just to ground the discussion of what happened in Egypt in those 3 most eventful years of its political history. Inspired by Tunisia, in January 2011, an 18-day mass uprising and sit-in Cairo's central square, Tahrir Square, extraordinarily leads to the toppling of Hosni Mubarak, who ruled for 29 years, ever since he assumed the presidency from the assassinated Anwar Sadat in 1981. In short order, the military generals take power in the Roman sense of being dictators, a temporary executive. They claimed that they were going to take power for 6 months and pledged to hold free and fair elections. Those elections were indeed held, not on schedule, but 2012, the first 6 months of 2012 were extraordinary because for the first time in 60 years, Egyptians elected the first democratically elected parliament under universal suffrage and the first competitive presidential elections brought to power, or brought to office, to be more precise, Mohamed Morsi, who is a leading member of the Muslim Brothers, Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin. Morsi spent a crisis-ridden year in the presidency before he was toppled in July 2013 by a coalition of the military general who he appointed as defense minister and civilian opponents, as well as a mass movement that looked very similar to 2011. 6 months or a year later, this series of upheavals came to an end when the defense minister, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, donned a civilian suit and staged plebiscitary elections that sealed his control, not just of the presidency, but as we speak now, Egypt now is under a personalized version of military rule under the leadership of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, consolidated his regime, and put a decisive end to these 3 years of turnover, uncertainty, upheaval, major demands, et cetera. So that's what we're talking about, and that's what the meat of the book handles or deals with. Let's look at what some of the most knowledgeable, popular, serious analyses put forth about how to think about these years. Okay. One very popular analysis among both Egyptian activists and also observers of Egypt inside the country and abroad sees this as a story of a military junta, or the military high command, expertly using the opportunity of the uprising that they did not foresee, but they expertly used it, as many elites do, to assert their primacy over state and society in a continuation of what is often said to be 60 years of military rule. So ever since the beginning of Egypt's military-led republic in 1952, this line of thinking puts the military front and center at every moment in Egyptian politics, in contemporary Republican Egyptian politics since 1952. And they see the 2011 uprising as nothing but the latest iteration of the military using and responding to both challenges and opportunities to further reinforce their control over the nation. And this argument is made particularly in the last chapter of Zainab Abul-Magd's book, Militarizing the Nation. Another line of analysis looks to a different actor, specifically the young activists and civilian democracy activists who became activated and laid the groundwork for much of the uprising. And the most prominent study here that I invoke is the sociologist Asif Bayat's 2017 book, Revolution Without Revolutionaries. Bayat makes an argument about all of the Arab uprisings, particularly Egypt and Tunisia, and he focuses on the way in which so many of these democracy activists worked in a global context in which, as he puts it, revolution had become a dirty word. So they themselves were socialized not to think in terms of radical change or takeover of the state, but they had their political horizons limited by the idea of reform. He borrows the journalist Timothy Garton Ash's notion of revolutions, that these were not full-scale revolutions along the scale of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution or even the 79 Iranian Revolution, where there was a cadre of avant-garde, vanguardist parties that pushed through extraordinarily transformative change, but these were more piecemeal, modest, ambivalent revolutionaries. And because they had no vision of thoroughgoing change, and because they were even anti-partisan and anti-political, it was very easy for older forces, particularly the military, to piggyback on the upheaval and ultimately turn it to their ends. Last sort of class or group of explanations is very popular among political scientists. The late Alfred Steppen, who's one of the major founders of the Democratic Transition School and Anglo-American social sciences, looking at Egypt, pointed out or has been saying ever since 2013, the intensive negotiations among the leading secularists and leading Islamists to overcome mutual fears of the sort that we've documented for Tunisia never really occurred in Egypt. And similarly, from a very different tradition, but coming to a strikingly similar conclusion, probably one of the most insightful analysts of the Arab uprisings, the Palestinian intellectual Azmi Bishara, points out in his 2-volume masterpiece on Egypt's revolution, Thawrat Masr, the decisive factor, in my view, he says, is the inability of the pro-revolution forces to agree on democratic principles and impose them as a united front on the ancien regime. So political scientists, broadly speaking, focus on the way in which many of the civilian actors in Egypt's transition or Egypt's democratic upheaval failed to come up with the hard work of bargaining and coming up with a minimum set of shared demands. And that also gave an opening to the old elites and the anti-democratic forces to eventually stage their decisive victory at the coup in July 2013. I have no quarrel with any of these 3 major schools as I've put them or staged them. These are by people who are extraordinarily knowledgeable of Egypt itself, but also generally of the social science literature on transitions. I have almost a childlike question. They come to their conclusions by completely evading and or ignoring some of the actual events that constituted this upheaval. And I think they do that because the events are so tangled and so compressed in time and so confusingly interlocked that it would take a lot of painstaking detective work of the sort that I claim that I've done to really wade into them. But I also think more seriously that there's a certain style of social analysis that conceives of the importance of any event in terms of its outcome, that it doesn't really matter what happens at the beginning because that's a mess anyway. So what you want to look at are the causes, which is everything that happens before the event or the series of events, and then you want to look at the consequences. But how the events actually played out doesn't really matter because it's ephemeral. Okay. And this actually gets to the philosophy of the social sciences. So what events am I talking about? Let me just give you a rundown of what actually happened in these 3 years. 2 popularly supported military coups against very different kinds of presidents and regimes, one in 2011 and one in 2013. 5 governments or cabinets. 2 founding elections, one for the presidency and one for parliament. 3 constitution writing assemblies, 3 constitutional referenda, countless mass demonstrations and workplace protests, and really they are countless. I haven't seen a decisive figure counting them, although there are very, very good data sets available where people are trying to compile simply because of the sheer number of these. And then also just variations and extraordinary diversity, a crazy quilt diversity of assertions of collective identity by Egypt's various subcultures, including the military generals, judicial personnel, civil servants, Coptic Egyptians, Salafi Egyptians, Sufi Egyptians, women, regional interests. Like any upheaval, this was a moment in which Egypt's various constituted but also new interest groups made a bid for having a say in how they're ruled. And so all of this is sort of leapfrogged over by the existing approaches to arrive at conclusions that give us a neater and more satisfying reason of basically what went wrong. Okay. What I want to do, or what I'm urging is I'm tapping into an older tradition. And I want to begin by confronting the ambiguity at the heart of Egypt's uprising. So on the one hand, it's not exactly a classic revolution, however we conceive of those classic revolutions, but we basically conceive of them in dramatic terms. The old elite disappears and a new vanguard takes its place. It's also not exactly like classic or textbook democratic transitions, and the literature there has painted democratic transitions as essentially bargained phenomena or pacted transitions in which the democratic forces and moderate members of the old regime engage in confidence building treaties or pacts, literally settlements, in which they agree on a minimum set of demands and push those forward against extremists on both sides. Egypt doesn't look like that. What I find much more sort of capacious and helpful is to, instead of try to smush all of the disorder, the seeming disorder of Egypt into one of these already prepackaged kind of categorical conceptual categories, the more open-ended way in which Przeworski puts it, These are strategic situations that arise when a dictatorship collapses. I like the recovery of the sense of uncertainty that he has. When you have the ejection of an autocrat that has been in power for 30 years, instead of expecting pacts among elites, democratic elites, and instead of expecting that old elites will vanish, we should expect a lot of uncertainty. To further this argument, I draw on elements of sociology and sociological thinking that really helped me, quite literally, they really helped me, provided me with kind of a crutch to make sense of the extraordinary interlocking of all of these events. So I pulled from my old advisor's, one of his studies, European revolutions, this notion of a revolutionary situation, which is the centerpiece and the anchor and the main protagonist in the book, to the extent that you can think of a concept as a protagonist. He borrows this concept, of course, from Lenin and Trotsky, and he makes it usable for social analysis. And at one point, he, in the crucial quote, identifies as a revolutionary situation as a shift in power over the state that threatens every group having a stake in the existing structure of power, at the same time as it offers new opportunities to every group, including existing power holders, having the capacity to enhance its interests by acting quickly. In the same way, and from a different angle than Przeworski, Tilley's conception, first of all, deflates the notion of a revolution and brings it back to the idea that we're going to see a lot of very hectic politics, and there are going to be a lot of politics. But he also brings in this notion that it's an acute conjunction of opportunity and threat. It is a moment of extraordinary and open-ended opportunities for some, but it's also a moment of real threat. And that can't but lead to an intense episode of volatility. Last but not least, I want to leave you with this, I think, understudied article, but it was extremely helpful for me. One of Tilley's colleagues, the sociologist, the late sociologist Arthur Stinchcombe, in a wonderful review article on revolutions and building new governments, captured for me what was so confusing as I was looking at all of these events and literally having to make lists of the actors that kept coming in and then disappearing, and the lists of all these events. He points out that by a political revolution, he says, I mean a time of rapid, often erratic change in the relative power of social classes, ethnicities, regions, political parties, legislatures, military groups, royal lineages. For such instability of relative power to continue, different groups and people have to have different estimates of how it will all come out. Otherwise, they would make deals in light of who's going to win and so produce stability. When I saw this, this was my light bulb moment, because it finally made me see that the constant shifts in relative power, which those of us who lived through this and witnessed it, this was the most confusing thing about Egypt between 2011 and 2013. At any single moment, it was really hard to know who was up and who was down, because that sometimes changed literally in the space of a week. And that is the point. What these sociologists are trying to tell us is that instead of ignoring these kinds of like molecules in a bubbling cauldron, one of the most evocative metaphors that Trotsky comes up with, you got to take this as your object of analysis and trace the ups and downs, the coalitions, the breaking of coalitions, the realignments, the making of new coalitions. And I think the challenge for me, and if this book succeeds, it will have done this in a way that's tractable and not confusing and not overwhelming and not getting us so into the weeds that we forget what it is that we're actually studying. I mean, you can, of course, come up with a brilliant narrative of this happened and then that happened and then that happened, but that's not what I do. My narrative is very selective, and it's guided by these conceptual lenses to see, okay, let's look at some of these groups, some of which will be new, some of which will be old, and let's look at their fluctuating relations, because fluctuation is the name of the game in a revolutionary situation. Because of this fluctuation, okay, all of these actors, conflict is going to be the name of the game, one, and conflict is going to be made in the language of sovereignty, which many people find to be disastrous for pact making and disastrous for compromise. And that's exactly it. Because everyone is acting quickly or slowing down their opponents to gain advantage, they're going to be making their claims in terms of we have ultimate power. And that's exactly what happened. The military was making claims that they have the ultimate founding power to be not just the arbiters of Egypt's political scene, but to be the ultimate deciders. When the new parliament was elected, they were making those claims in terms of popular sovereignty, and Tahrir, throughout the 3 years, was constantly making claims of popular sovereignty inherent in the power of crowds to unseat the autocrat and to also give instructions to new governments who would rule Egypt, but would exclude them, which is how they saw it. What is multiple sovereignty? These competing claims to supreme power or supremacy within the country over the state by two or more irrepressible power blocks. What keeps this going, this potential standoff going, is that segments of public opinion support each claim. It's not like the military made this claim without public support. That's one of the things we have to contend with. There were elements of public support and even political support by civilians for the military's claim to be the ultimate arbiter. And the other reason why this extends through time and looks confusing is that neither of these contending factions are able to exterminate each other, partly because the state's coercive apparatus, though it tried multiple times, it was unable to fully crush these rival claims until 6 months after the coup, as I'll show you. So let me race through what this looks like in those 3 years and then conclude and get some discussion going. All of 2011 can be understood as this contest over who holds ultimate sovereignty or ultimate power. And because elections hadn't been held yet, it was the extraordinary power of Tahrir. Every Friday, there was a mass demonstration in Tahrir. And every Friday, that mass demonstration was divided among different squares within Tahrir in Cairo and throughout the squares. And we can trace the making of the political conflict and the issues that were at stake and the pressures that kept being put on the generals simply by tracing what happened every Friday, where, and how the contending even civilian forces themselves were starting to find or develop fissures amongst themselves. At the same time, the generals began by mid-2011 to make much more blunt and explicit demands to be the rulers of Egypt and to extend the 6-month timeline all the way up to 2013. They were forced to backtrack by this on November, the major demonstrations in November 2011. Okay. If we skip to 2012, the seating of the first democratically elected parliament under universal suffrage complicated this situation. It didn't tampen it down. It heightened the mobilization because now you had, at minimum, and this again really is a heuristic, it's a minimum of 3 power blocks making claims to chart Egypt's political future, making claims for primacy in how to chart Egypt's political future. Within Parliament, I have a whole chapter on how Parliament itself, of course, as with all maiden parliaments, was internally fractious, and ultimately, partly as a result of that internal fragmentation, it was very easy for the generals using a court order to shut Parliament after 5 years of its short life without much of a public outcry. Many people in Egypt, not all, but many people in Egypt were not sorry to see this parliament go. The crisis-ridden year of the first elected president's tenure was a daily conflict between the president, the generals, the president's civilian opponents, and what is not shown here, but is part of the major story, the increasingly assertive judges on Egypt's various courts, a minority of whom were allied with the president and the majority who were seeking to unseat the president in the form of a Supreme Court ruling that was hanging over his head. There's another important agency involved here. I'd be happy to talk about it in the Q&A, and that is the Constituent Assembly or the Constitutional Writing Assembly. I end the notion of a revolutionary situation after the coup. It didn't end with the coup. After the coup, there were 6 months of mobilization where Egypt was divided still between the resistance to the coup and those who supported the coup. But the real end of the revolutionary situation comes when Abdel Fattah el-Sisi announced his intention to contest the presidency. And it was very obvious, of course, that this would not be a competitive election. What was very clear was that this was going to be the closing of the curtain, or the drawing of the curtain, on 3 years of intense and unceasing upheaval and the beginning of a new phase in Egypt's political history, an unprecedented concentration of power in the executive, to the point where the executive, the militarized executive, has now also usurped not just legislative power, which we know in Egypt's previous political history, but what's new here is the usurpation of judicial functions. Partly because Sisi has learned the lesson of the Mubarak years that the judiciary developed as a counterweight, a relatively independent counterweight to the presidency. Let me conclude by, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk more about this in the Q&A, what am I saying sort of analytically, in addition to hopefully advancing a different interpretation of Egypt's revolutionary uprising? I think that I'm drawing into an older literature that never saw revolution and democracy as two completely separate things. They saw revolutions as moments where politics is very intense. It's like politics on speed. So revolutions aren't this separate thing that you have to handle with different vocabulary. They're an outgrowth of politics. They don't transcend politics. And at the same time, they also recognize that democracies, especially first democracies after decades of authoritarian non-competitive politics, is very revolutionary in the sense that it threatens an extraordinary range of vested interests, not just in the country, but also abroad. And I haven't said anything about the foreign actors that were key in Egypt's revolutionary situation. I mentioned them in the book, or talk about them in the book, nowhere near enough now in retrospect, but I'd be happy to take that up in the Q&A. Let me leave you with this photo, one of the countless claims that we had crowdsourced in Tahrir and the mass rallies. This is a particularly evocative one that I use also as a visual illustration in the book. And one of the many reasons I love this particular slogan, you'll see that it was plastered onto a graffitied and incinerated police truck in Tahrir Square, is it recalls us to the inversions at the heart of both democracy and revolution. Democracy and revolution at their heart, one thing they do share is this idea that the people have the capacity to rule themselves and can do it. They will do it with a lot of conflict. But I just want to bring back this older literature of looking at democracy and revolution as sharing some powerful affinities that help us understand, I think, a lot about what happened in Egypt and the aftermath. And thank you so much for your attentive listening.